Pal, welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the French Revolution, right? And we're getting closer and closer and closer to that all-important radical phase of the revolution, right? We're at the back end of the liberal phase right now where things are not feeling that liberal at this point, right? Because we spent some time in class today talking about how France is now at war with Austria and Prussia and a couple of other countries that are now forming these things called coalitions where they're all like teaming up on France, but somehow France is still just like beating them back and like actually like get after it and like actually winning some wars, right? Which is absolutely bananas. So going into it though, we then also talked about how that war though is causing a lot of chaos and hysteria back in Paris, right? Like back in Paris, things are getting a little shifty, okay? We got, like, the Sans-Culottes members are running around, and they're burning stuff and killing people in the streets, and the Jerrys or the Jacobins are basically, like, egging them on a little bit, and they're just like, hey, why don't y'all go, like, do that some more, right? Just go, like, and they're actually just, like, continually, like, pushing them to do more violent actions, and it all culminated, or not all culminated, actually, but one really big one of those was actually on Courtney Everett's birthday, right? Like, so on August 10th, 1792, with the attack on the Tuileries, right? When the attack on the Tuileries, where this guy, of course, none other than Louis XVI, was actually living there under house arrest at the time, and a huge mob of Sans-Culottes members stormed in there, took the royal family out of there, arrested them, and then took them to a prison. Not like a chill prison either, but like a prison. Like a bad one, right? And so, like, and they actually separated the entire royal family into different cells, and poor Marie Antoinette was forced to be down the hallway from her son, where she couldn't see him, but she could literally hear guards, like, beating him, like, every single day, right? Which is a terrible, terrible life to be living for her at this point, because she's not the best queen ever, but man alive, she did not deserve all that, right? Like, so, like, now, but going into it, though, things are getting really, really dicey and extremely hectic. And the Sans-Culottes are still not satisfied, right? They're not satisfied with the fact that the king is actually just in jail, and he's in prison, and he's behind bars. Another big event that happens actually almost just about a month later, right? Like about a month later, was this event known as the September Massacres in 1792, right? So a month later, after the royal family had been ripped out of the Tuileries Palace and put into a prison, the September Massacres break out, where the Sans-Culottes members are growing really, really anxious and very fearful that the coalition forces of the Austrians and the Prussians and the Russians and the English are going to break through the borders of France, get into Paris, and they're going to then wreak havoc on the revolution. Well, the Sans-Culottes members are, of course, are mostly poor working men and stuff like that. So this rumor is kind of really fueling this entire thing. But in their mind, they're like, well, if the Austrians were to get into Paris, where would they find people loyal to put inside of their armies? Where would they find people to reinforce their armies? Well, they would go to the prisons, because the prisons is now where the royal family is, and the prisons are also where the enemies of the revolution are. Right? That's where we've locked up people that didn't do what we told them to, right? And so what ends up happening, though, is they start just going into prison after prison and ripping people out into the streets and then executing them and murdering mass numbers of people. Several hundred died in the month of September when they were ripped out into the streets and literally decapitated or executed. There's literally a kid right here playing with a guy's severed head right during the September massacres, okay? And the most of them that were actually executed, the royal family did not die, by the way. The royal family did not die. They were just basically they were arrested and they were just officially put into jail, right? And so what ends up happening, though, after this as well, is that people are realizing that this is becoming almost uncontrollable, right? The Marquis de Lafayette is not there anymore to actually defend the people. Also, it's a crazy important fact and a very fun fact. The Marquis de Lafayette actually hears about this stuff going on because he's on the front lines of the war and he's out there fighting the Austrians. And literally, he just goes like this, y'all. He just surrenders to them. He goes up to the Austrians. He's like, look, if I go back to Paris, they're going to kill me too. There's no way that I'm not going to die if I go back there. So I'm just going to surrender to you guys. How's that sound? And he spent out the rest of the bulk of the liberal and the radical phase of the revolution actually in Austrian custody, right? So going into it though, the monarchy will be completely done out with. And then most of the people that died on the September massacres were actually the priests that refused to take, the refractory priests that refused to take the oath of the civil constitution of the clergy, right? Now, as you can tell, things are getting really out of hand, right? The monarchy, though, right after the September massacres, is going to be abolished, which means that France is now a republic. And for those of you who remember, when we talked about the Roman Republic, right? For those of you who remember when they offered Julius Caesar a crown, a golden laurel wreath crown, and said, "Sir, will you be our king?" He took it and threw it down to the ground. He was like, there are no kings in a republic. There is no king of Rome, right? Well, the thing about it is, if the monarchy is abolished and now France is a republic, that means Louis and his whole family, they're just people now. They're not king or queen, royal or unroyal, noble or anywhere in between. They're just people. And so what ends up happening is, just like in Rome, republics don't have kings, so they decide to put Louis on trial for his crimes against the French government. And what ends up happening is they vote for his execution. And when they actually come down to the vote, one vote ends up passing it, and Louis would be executed by the National Convention, also known as the National Assembly. The National Assembly is what we're going to call them all the time in class. The National Assembly, that same group that was formed on the tennis court oath, is the same group that's been running the revolution this entire time, right? But the thing about it is that the National Assembly now has members like Maximilian Robespierre in it. It's got George Danton's running around. It's got Jean-Paul Marat's, who are encouraging all of this violence and stuff like that. They actually voted and decided to put Louis on trial for his crimes, and the Jacobins outnumbered the Girondins inside of the National Assembly, and they voted for his execution on January 1793. And at the scaffold, he said, "I forgive those who are guilty of my death." And they actually pulled up his head and showed it to the entire crowd and said, "God save the king," right? And they executed him using this newfangled device that was actually called a guillotine, right? A guillotine, actually, as you can see, this guy turning away, shuddering at the pure violence, and them holding the head of Louis XVI in front of the people of France. But literally, his head was cut off and severed in front of everyone. But if he is dead, then who's now going to be in charge, right? Well, guess what? It's none other than your boys, George Danton, Jean-Paul Marat, and Maximilian Robespierre, when they formed this thing called the Committee of Public Safety. But we're going to actually talk a little bit more about this in a clip that I have coming up, but I'll see you in a second. Y'all enjoy the rest of this flip. They call themselves the Committee of Public Safety. Oh, let me just give you a heads up. Committee of Public Safety, not that safe, right? So, not very safe. It's not going to make you feel all warm and cozy. They're mainly out there to destroy you and execute people, and execute a lot of them at that, right? So, Committee of Public Safety I like to talk about a lot because I think it's a very ironic name, right? Three guys that want the death and destruction of everything that ever was around before the revolution started, including the nobles that used to collect taxes and a lot of other figures as well, are beginning to demand authority over the entire government. It's a very intense time. It's a very, very intense thing going on. So the Committee of Public Safety comes into power, and they start ruling as a de facto monarchy. Their job is to basically take over following the death of Louis XVI. Now, technically, what was still in charge is the National Convention, and the Committee of Public Safety is just one small group within that thing. But Maximilian Robespierre and Georges Danton are at the helm of the Committee of Public Safety, and they are demanding to use executions and massive amounts of death to scare away counter-revolutionaries, right? Because you have to understand, some of the cities in France were flabbergasted by what's going on in Paris. They were like, holy crap, they just killed Louis? Oh my God, they just killed all those priests in September? Oh my God, a bunch of poor people captured Louis in August, a month before that, and almost killed him? Oh my God, there's these Jacobins and Girondins arguing with each other? They're all freaking out. And they start not wanting to be a part of the revolution. One of the most famous cities that does this is called Toulon, right? Toulon decides to break away from the revolution and become autonomous, and they start trading with the British. They send Napoleon down there to take over the whole place and shoot a bunch of those people, right? So to try and scare away counter-revolutionaries, the Committee of Public Safety wants to basically execute anybody that stands in their way, to basically say, look, you're either with us or you're against us, and if you're against us, you will die, right? So they purged and executed the entire Girondin Club and its members. They had them executed, they had them arrested, put on trial, and then executed. The club that they were against, remember, Jacobins versus Girondins, the Jacobins had them all executed, except for a few, right? So a handful of them that were actually secretly hidden away, right? And what's their new toy that they want to do all these executions with? None other than the guillotine, right? The guillotine is going to be a very important new device. Louis XVI was actually the fourth guy to be executed via the guillotine, right? Before the establishment of the Committee of Public Safety. But the Committee of Public Safety decides to adopt this brand new device to execute as many people as possible, as fast and as efficiently as possible. So let's talk about this bad boy real quick and how this thing works, right? So this right here is the guillotine, named after its inventor. The guy who invented it was known as Guillotine. That was his last name, right? So this device that stands at about 14 feet tall, as you can see, is very, very large and is higher than a basketball rim, right? It's painted red for a reason. to hide the stains of blood, right? So, and also, that bad boy right there, that blade, weighs close to 100 pounds, right? It's slanted on an edge and it is razor sharp. So when you pull the lever, it comes flying down, cuts the person's head off their neck, head falls into a basket, and then you either do one of two things. You flip the bench up like it's a toilet seat through a trap door, or you dump them into a wicker coffin right here to the next of it, right? And then you move on. Basically, this execution device is the Walmart express lane of executing people during the French Revolution. We're trying to get you in and out of here quick, right? Now, really quick, but why? Why was the guillotine adopted? Now, this is very important. You desperately need to write this down. The guillotine was adopted because it was considered egalitarian. Now, as my wife walks by with our wicker basket of laundry, it is now reminding me that heads used to end up in those things. But the big thing about it is the guillotine was considered egalitarian, right? Egalitarian means equal and just, right? So now, reason why is because poor people and rich people before the French Revolution used to be executed very differently. Rich people were actually usually decapitated and or hung very quickly, and their deaths were usually very, very fast, right? Some were even poisoned as a way to actually make their deaths very quick and very easy, right? Oh, you're rich and powerful, so you should be executed very fast to help with your little sensibilities, right? So whereas poor people, on the other hand, were typically used as public displays when they were executed. The most common way to execute somebody, sweetheart, was this thing known as breaking on the wheel. Do you know what that is? Breaking a person on the wheel was how they executed poor people. They wouldn't run them over. They would tie them to a wagon wheel and then use the blunt end of an axe to break all of their bones very slowly, and these executions would take over an hour before they then actually chop their heads off.
This is why I'm glad we have TikTok.
This is why you're glad you have TikTok.
Because then people are not tying each other to wagon wheels and hurting each other.
Yeah, okay. TikTok apparently is saving you from tying each other to wagon wheels and being broken on the wheel, right? But that was the big difference, right? Rich people were executed quickly, poor people were not. The guillotine was invented to execute everyone equally and just as fast, right? So, the big thing about it, though, is it is going to be the device that the Committee of Public Safety adopts to do all their executions. Now, the Committee of Public Safety, while they were in charge, they reigned for about a year, from about 1793 to about 1794. And this period of time where they were in charge was known as the Reign of Terror, right? Why would the Committee of Public Safety be in charge during a period known as the Reign of Terror? Well, I'll tell you why, children. The biggest reason why is because they wanted to use fear to keep away counter-revolutionaries, right? Remember, we talked about that a little bit ago. The Committee of Public Safety was founded by Georges Danton, Maximilien Robespierre, technically not Jean-Paul Marat. The rat man, the sewer guy, was technically not a part of the Committee of Public Safety. It was technically part of this thing called the Committee of Public Surveillance. And he was actually in charge of writing people's names down in a list of who would be executed. But we're going to pretend like he's in it, right? But the Committee of Public Safety would actually use fear to keep counter-revolutionaries from overthrowing the revolutionary government. They wanted to execute so many people that you would think twice before you ever tried to buck back against them, right? So the Reign of Terror was characterized by violence and an overuse of execution, right? It is defined as a period of remorseless repression or bloodshed, which led to extreme changes in France, right? This whole thing, if you Googled right now, Reign of Terror, and looked at the dictionary definition of it, it would literally say a remorseless repression or bloodshed, right? Now, biggest thing about it is remember, why are they using this? To prevent counter-revolutionaries from overthrowing the revolutionary government. Now, when we're going forward, you need to understand that the Committee of Public Safety under the leadership of Maximilien Robespierre and Georges Danton are going to freak so many people out that even the Marquis de Lafayette was willingly arrested in Austria to stay away from Paris after they came to power, because he knew if he came back that he would be executed, right? Marquis de Lafayette, the hero of the earlier part of this story, feared the Committee of Public Safety because he knew if he returned to Paris after the war that they were going to have him executed, right? So the thing about it is they also bring on a massive amount of change, right? The Committee of Public Safety ushers in all these crazy over-the-top changes to France while they're in power, because they want to basically remake Paris and leave the old France behind. They want to remake the new France to be a completely new autonomous thing that is nothing like the France that came before it, right? So they first of all started off with renaming all the months and days of the week, which was really weird. Every month had 30 days. They still had 12 months, but they all had different names based on like the seasons and stuff. Like, for example, one of them that is now July was called Thermidor because it was hot. It means the hot month, right? So, like, the months had 30 days, which I know some of you are like, Mr. Terry, that means that you only have 360 days. What about the other 5? Don't get me started, all right? So, like, this is why they were only in power for a year. They canceled Christianity as well. They canceled Catholicism completely because after the September massacres, they didn't really necessarily need Catholicism anymore because most of those priests were all dead. Now, so they canceled Christianity and they created this new thing called the cult of the supreme being, basically being like a deist cult. They kind of used Voltaire's ideas, right? They closed churches. They tried to turn Notre Dame into a shopping mall. They dropped the day of Sunday because they were like, look, we don't need Sundays anymore because that was for church and we don't do that here anymore, right? They had 10-day weeks with only one day that had a weekend. So they actually dropped Sundays and added 3 other days or 4 other days. It was very, very weird. They set the price of bread as well, which is a very, very anti-free market economic concept. And they drafted men in France to fight in the war. Because a lot of people in France are like, okay, I didn't start off doing this whole revolution thing for this, right? Like, I didn't start off doing all this stuff so 3 guys could be in power and execute people left and right, right? So people had to start being drafted. Now, the draft forced men to like fight in the war, which is going to make a lot of people very, very upset and a lot of people very, very angry, right? Now, the thing about it going forward, though, is Robespierre had anyone who opposed the revolution executed. Anybody who opposed any ideas of the Revolutionary Party or the Jacobins would be put on trial and executed. You could be executed for something as simple as saying something negative about the revolution. Like if we were having a conversation at the grocery store and I look back at like Gianna and I'm like, hey, Gianna, don't you think this revolution's getting out of hand? If, like, Damari, who works for the Committee of Public Safety, overheard me, could have me arrested and executed, right? He also, like, would make executions like a public event. The Committee of Public Safety would tell everybody they were supposed to come watch the executions. Jot this down. The executions were a public event. They were considered educational. Women were told to bring knitting into the crowd so they could keep themselves occupied, but they wanted their children there more than anything else so they could watch the executions happen. And children in the crowd were given little toy guillotines to play with their dolls when they went home. It was considered to be the basic example of everything was that we are going to murder and destroy anyone that goes against the revolution whatsoever. Now, to give you an understanding, though, not everybody was on board with this, all right? Most French revolutionary citizens thought things were getting aggressively out of hand.